Prince Andrew's public life as he knew it is over. In an unprecedented move, the Duke of York says he's asked his mother, the Queen, for permission to step back from public duties.
Ex-royal cop Paul Page barges into the spotlight armed with sworn statements, rare documents, and a trail of corroborating evidence that threatens to unmask Prince Andrew's darkest secrets. The hush that once wrapped the palace now fractures into open outrage as dates, meetings, and financial traces are exposed. No euphemisms, no softening spin. Velvet corridors echo with the weight of revelation as allies scramble and denials fray. As the nation watches and institutions brace for fallout, one question remains: how far will this scandal truly reach? Let's find out. The storm behind palace doors. It often begins with a whisper, stories shared in quiet tones by those who once worked inside the royal palaces. The glittering image of monarchy, polished for the cameras, hides a far more complex reality. And when it comes to Prince Andrew, the accounts from those closest to his daily life paint a portrait not of charm and discipline, but of temper, entitlement, and an attitude that kept even his protectors uneasy. For the police officers assigned to guard him, the job was never simple. Their duty was to keep him safe from outside threats, yet much of their stress came from the man they were protecting. Accounts suggest Andrew's treatment of staff was difficult at best, demeaning at worst. Shouting, swearing, and name-calling seemed to flow easily from him, sometimes sparked by the smallest delays or minor inconveniences. Complaints about his behavior existed, but who among them could confront the Queen with such problems? In a rigid system where hierarchy ruled, most knew better than to rock the boat. Silence, it seemed, was safer than honesty. The sense of entitlement described was extraordinary. Guards recall moments when Andrew behaved as though every corner of the palace existed purely to satisfy his mood. Some speculated whether his unpredictable rages pointed to deeper struggles, though what those might be was never clear. What was certain was the tension his presence created. Staff never knew if a routine task might end with harsh words hurled in their direction. One story that stayed with many was his behavior at the heavy anti-terror barriers outside palace grounds. These gates, designed for maximum security, took precious seconds to lower. Andrew, often behind the wheel of his own car, would barrel towards them at speed. If the barrier wasn't lowered quickly enough, he would explode in fury, rolling down his window to berate officers, calling them useless, sometimes using far harsher language. For the very people risking themselves to guard him, the irony was bitter. Some even joked darkly about what might happen if one day the barrier didn't lower in time. The strange episodes were not limited to the palace gates. Inside Windsor, in the Queen's corridor, the private passage outside Her Majesty's apartments, security cameras once picked up a suspicious figure pacing back and forth. Officers rushed in, imagining an intruder, only to find Andrew himself. When approached, his response was sharp: "This is my house and I'll go where I want." Now off what unsettled many was not just the rudeness, but the oddness of it all. Why was he loitering there, outside his mother's rooms, when she wasn't even present? No explanation was ever given. It is details like these that build Andrew's reputation as one of the most difficult royals to serve. To the public, he was once the party prince, splashed across tabloids for his travels, parties, and wealthy companions. But to those inside the palace, he was someone who drained patience, a man who treated privilege as license to ignore rules. Some guards felt he walked through life as though accountability simply didn't exist for him. This disconnect, the dashing royal of magazine covers versus the angry figure behind palace gates, became clearer with time. His behavior, some argue, reflected not only his own character, but also a broader culture of silence. In the monarchy, where duty is prized and loyalty demanded, staff were expected to endure. Few dared challenge him. After all, how many protection officers could risk telling the Queen her son needed reining in? And so the stories lingered in the shadows. The reckless drives at the barriers, the pacing in corridors, the sharp words that left staff humiliated. Each memory added another layer to an image of Andrew, not as a misunderstood prince, but as a man whose power insulated him from consequence. Now, as whispers turn to louder conversations, questions remain. Was this simply arrogance, a byproduct of privilege unchecked? Or does it reveal something darker, an attitude that thrived because no one dared to intervene? Whatever the case, the accounts from those who saw him daily remind us that behind the palace's polished facade are human stories, and not all of them reflect the fairy tale we're told. But what hidden story do Prince Andrew's teddy bears reveal about Windsor's tensions? Stay connected to your screen. The teddy bears. Small rules, big tensions at Windsor. The teddy bears were arranged neatly on the bed, lined up in a private little order, soft toys placed with precision, their positions guided by a laminated photo tucked away in a drawer. At first glance, it might sound silly, almost childlike. But the truth behind that picture hinted at something more unsettling, a household where the tiniest details mattered because a single mistake could spark a royal temper. On weekends, when the Queen and Prince Philip went to Windsor and other royals occupied their lodges, the palace took on a different rhythm. Security teams carried out checks inside the family's private rooms, panic buttons hidden near beds, officers stationed outside apartments 24 hours a day, and regular alarm tests were all part of the security system. Yet these safety measures also brought officers and staff deep into the most personal corners of royal life. And sometimes, their task was not just protection, but also maintaining a fragile peace within the household. It was during one such routine check that an officer recalls stepping into Prince Andrew's apartment. What he saw caught him off guard. A collection of teddy bears spread across the bed. For a grown man's suite, it looked strangely like a child's room. When a colleague pulled open a drawer, a laminated photo slipped out, showing the bears laid out in the exact arrangement they occupied on the pillows. The instruction was clear: put them back precisely that way, or the prince would lash out at the maids. The image of a grown man's mood, depending on the placement of stuffed toys, may seem almost comical, but for the staff, it was far from a joke. That small photo became a symbol of control, an object that dictated how they worked, spoke, and moved. To them, it wasn't harmless eccentricity, it was coercion. Following the ritual meant avoiding humiliation, while one slip risked an angry outburst. This is how life inside the palaces often blurred into something strange. Staff learned quickly that not all demands were equal. Some requests were rooted in security, some in comfort, and others in sheer habit or control. For security officers, the focus was supposed to be safety, wiring, panic buttons, fast responses. Yet when they also had to warn maids about toy placement to prevent shouting, the line between duty and emotional labor became disturbingly thin. Windsor and Buckingham Palace, to the outside world, are grand symbols of tradition, but behind their walls, they function as workplaces, intensely scrutinized, tightly controlled, and full of unseen rituals. The officers on duty worked with precision, reacting instantly to alarms, sweeping corridors, and responding to unexpected movement on cameras. Sometimes, the intruder caught on film turned out to be an outsider. Other times, awkwardly, it was a senior royal wandering where they should not be. Protocol demanded procedure, even when that meant clashing with the very figures they were meant to serve. In that context, the laminated card of teddy bears stands out. Was it just a quirky system, a way to keep order in a room and prevent chaos? Or was it something darker, a tool of control, proof of how small, arbitrary rules could dominate the lives of those expected to obey them? Inside a system where hierarchy was absolute, staff survival often depended on anticipating moods, following rituals, and never asking why. For the public, royal life is often painted in bright colors, state occasions, lavish parties, and affectionate nicknames. But stories from inside tell a more complex tale. Exhausted officers, small rituals, and strict unwritten rules filled the days behind the curtains. To outsiders, the teddy bears might look like harmless eccentricity. To those who lived it, they symbolized entitlement, quick tempers, and a culture where speaking up could mean losing your job. In the end, such details matter not because they are scandalous, but because they reveal how power works in closed systems. Staff did far more than clean rooms and test alarms. They managed moods, prevented outbursts, and sometimes rearranged toys to keep the household running smoothly. The question remains, without pointing fingers, without accusations, when privilege shapes private spaces in such peculiar ways, who really pays the price for keeping the peace? But what hidden truth links the servants, the dog, and the untouchable favorite? Stay glued to your screen to find out. The servants, the dog, and the untouchable favorite. The strange thing about palace life is how ordinary routines can reveal extraordinary truths. Take, for instance, the story of Bendix, the small cross Jack Russell Terrier that once belonged to Prince Andrew. For most people, a restless pet in the early hours might mean grumbling through a quick walk outside. But for Andrew, it meant pressing a button, summoning his valet in the middle of the night, and expecting the man to trudge through Windsor's gardens at 2 or 3 a.m. just to walk the dog. The valet in question, Paul, had been at Andrew's side for decades.
Prince Andrew was sat there with Ghislaine Maxwell, having this intimate picnic.
He packed his clothes, traveled with him, and lived in quarters so close that his life was almost tethered to the prince's whims. Yet despite this long service, whispers suggest Paul could barely stand him. Officers on patrol often caught sight of Paul taking Bendix out and stopping for a quiet smoke, where he confided his frustrations. To serve someone for 20 or 30 years and still feel such resentment speaks volumes. He once even joked, half bitterly, that when Andrew went skiing, he hoped he might ski straight off a cliff. That kind of remark might sound shocking, but for those who had witnessed the prince's behavior, it wasn't hard to understand. Stories about his temper, arrogance, and sheer disregard for those around him weren't rare. From shouting at maids over the placement of teddy bears on his bed to berating protection officers for the slightest delay at palace gates, Andrew's sense of entitlement seemed boundless. Some argue it wasn't entirely his fault. From childhood, he had been allowed to get away with behavior that others in the family might never have dared. Palace insiders often mutter the same explanation. He was the queen's favorite. Whether that's speculation or truth, it's a refrain that surfaces again and again. Being the favored child meant limits weren't imposed when perhaps they should have been. One former officer once suggested that if Prince Philip had been harsher, if he had literally stuffed a bar of soap into Andrew's mouth the first time he told a servant to shut up in a vulgar way, perhaps the patterns of entitlement would never have taken such deep root. Instead, he grew into adulthood with the same unchecked behavior, carried along by privilege and a lack of consequences. It didn't go unnoticed that Andrew often stood apart from his siblings, while each of them, in one way or another, carried the natural entitlement that comes with royal birth. He had a reputation for taking it further. He seemed to demand obedience rather than inspire it, expecting loyalty without giving respect in return. Life behind the palace walls was, and still is, shaped by archaic traditions and invisible hierarchies. For staff, that meant a constant balancing act, how to serve a prince who, by many accounts, was difficult, without openly showing discontent. For years, people kept their heads down, accepted insults, and endured impossible expectations. Few dared challenge him, because to do so meant risking their careers in a system where complaints often led nowhere. The image of a grown man furious over teddy bears out of place, or summoning a valet at 2 a.m. for a dog walk, paints a strange picture. It is almost childlike, yet mixed with a darker edge, the kind of behavior that leaves scars on those forced to endure it. So what do we make of all this? Was it the indulgence of a favored son who never truly grew up? Was it a symptom of a palace system that insulated him from reality? Or was it something more, a deep-seated entitlement that no amount of discipline could have changed? Whatever the reason, these glimpses into palace life show how power and privilege can twist ordinary routines into something extraordinary, and not always in a flattering way. They remind us that behind the gilded gates, the struggles are not just about ceremony or protocol, but about people navigating the moods of those born into untouchable status. But what hidden hierarchy truly governs palace life, shaping everything behind closed doors? Keep watching. Inside the hidden hierarchy of palace life. There's a structure within palace walls that few ever see, yet it governs everything. Not just the royals themselves, but even the people who work around them live inside a rigid class system. Former staff have described it almost like a miniature kingdom within the monarchy, a hierarchy where privilege, loyalty, and silence all carry enormous weight. At the top of this structure sit the senior household figures, the Queen's private secretary, the Lord Chamberlain, retired generals and colonels who step seamlessly from the military into ceremonial power. These advisors are often described as the rib cage of the monarchy, protectors, organizers, and gatekeepers who keep the institutions steady. Their world is one of white-gloved silver service, French menus, and carefully managed privilege. Beneath them, the middle tier belongs to the administrators and secretaries who work in the offices of senior royals, Princess Anne's team, Prince Andrew's aides, and others tasked with endless correspondence and official planning. They enjoy a certain comfort, but not the grandeur of the top table. And then comes the lowest rung, the maids, footmen, and service staff. Their canteens aren't lined with chandeliers or French menus. Instead, there might be little more than a microwave and a kettle. This quiet class division among staff mirrors the very hierarchy they serve, a reminder that in the palace, even loyalty is measured by rank. But loyalty is also deeply personal. Many of these staff members enter service as teenagers and stay for decades, sometimes half a century or more. The late Queen's ladies-in-waiting, for example, often served her faithfully for 50 years. Within those walls, palace service isn't just a job, it becomes a life. And that is where the problems begin. When loyalty is so deeply rooted, who dares to question a senior royal? Take Prince Andrew, for instance. His reputation for arrogance, entitlement, and temper has long been whispered about. Former protection officers have admitted that he spoke to staff like dirt, shouting over small details, swearing when things weren't done his way. Some even called his behavior coercive, designed to intimidate and control. Yet, despite this, almost no one held him to account. Why? Because in the palace, loyalty often trumps challenge. That's why, when scandals erupted years later linking him with Jeffrey Epstein, many people asked, didn't the police or protection officers know? The truth is more complicated. Royal protection officers were not his friends. They were staff. They weren't invited to dinners, nor did they socialize after hours. Their role was to guard, not to gossip. They might have spotted unusual patterns or small red flags at the time, but piecing them together would have required hindsight and the willingness to speak out against a senior royal. And inside that palace structure, who really dares to do that? In fact, those who did try to raise concerns often felt trapped. One officer described the unspoken rule: keep your head down, don't rock the boat, and take it. Complaints, no matter how valid, risked being ignored or silenced. After all, how many junior staff members were willing to be the one to march up to the Queen and say her son needed reining in? This silence, fueled by loyalty and hierarchy, created an environment where small eccentricities could spiral into bigger problems. From the way a room was arranged to how quickly barriers were lowered for a royal's car, every detail became a test of patience and control. And when someone like Andrew carried himself with unchecked entitlement, the imbalance only grew sharper. So perhaps the real intrigue isn't just about one prince's temper or behavior. It's about a system designed to protect, shield, and serve without question. A system where even the smallest staff member, bound by duty and decades of service, may feel too loyal or too powerless to ever speak out. And in that silence, rumors thrive, questions linger, and the royal family's most guarded secrets remain hidden behind the palace gates.
I had just been abused by a member of a royal family.
But what really happened with the mysterious visitor whose name never appeared? Could this change everything? Stay with us to find out. The visitor whose name never appeared. Gain might be Gain, or Gillian, or Ghislaine, depending on who you asked at the time. What mattered more was not how her name was pronounced, but how it was handled whenever she stepped through the gates of Buckingham Palace. According to those who worked closely in security, she was not just any guest. She was a familiar figure, arriving often to see Prince Andrew. yet shrouded in secrecy in a way that set her apart from others. The rules for palace visitors were normally clear. Every arrival, from prominent statesmen to close friends of the royals, had to be logged in the appointments book at the main entrance. The system was simple. Names were passed down from the various royal offices, written neatly in the ledger and confirmed at the gate. Without it, even the most expected of guests could not move freely. For obvious reasons, this system was vital. After all, Buckingham Palace was not just a home, but a symbol of the monarchy, one that drew both the powerful and, at times, the unstable who claimed they had come to visit the Queen herself. Yet in Ghislaine Maxwell's case, something unusual happened. Officers on duty were reportedly told not to record her name in the appointments book. No written trace, no official acknowledgement, just a quiet instruction to allow her through when she arrived to see the Duke of York. Such discretion was not normal procedure. It left many wondering, why the secrecy? Was it simply to avoid unwanted headlines, or was there something deeper, something the palace preferred to keep behind closed doors? At that time, Maxwell was already a figure shadowed by her father's infamous legacy. Robert Maxwell, once a towering media tycoon, had left behind a scandal of missing pension funds and a mysterious death at sea in 1991 when he fell from his yacht. Ghislaine, glamorous yet enigmatic, inherited both his wealth and the whispers that clung to his name. To see her moving through the halls of Buckingham Palace as a welcomed guest only added to the intrigue. And then there was the connection that would later become unavoidable: Jeffrey Epstein.
Even Jeffrey Epstein, a man who is not unknown to the pleasures of the flesh.
Before the world came to know the full weight of his crimes, he and Maxwell were already entwined in elite social circles, their names circulating among the rich, powerful, and royal. Prince Andrew's friendship with them has been one of the most discussed and criticized aspects of his public life. But for those inside the palace, the story seemed to begin with regular visits that staff were told to treat differently, even quietly. One security officer recalled the first time Maxwell's name came up. The instruction was simple but striking. Do not put her name in the book. No one explained why. They did not need to. The order itself spoke volumes, setting her apart from every other visitor who passed through those gates. For staff accustomed to order, routine, and accountability, it raised silent questions. What made this guest so untouchable that her visits could not even be written down? Speculation has only grown with time. Was it protection of privacy, a precaution against gossip, or a sign of the closeness between her and Andrew? The answers may never be fully known, but the memory lingers among those who stood at the palace gates, flipping through pages of carefully logged names of ambassadors, dignitaries, family friends, and noticing the blank space where one visitor's record should have been. What makes the story so fascinating is not only who she was, but how carefully her presence was managed. In a world where tradition and protocol govern nearly every detail, the absence of her name spoke louder than ink on a page. It left behind not just questions, but the sense of a hidden chapter in royal history, one that continues to capture curiosity to this day. So, what do you really think lies behind Prince Andrew's darkest secrets that an ex-royal cop claims to have proof of? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.